Compared to Britain, Australia would have to say we've had a good pandemic, but that doesn't mean there's nothing we can't learn from them. We can learn, and we should learn, from a whole raft of other countries. Where Britain might have been slow to get a grip on the acute phase of the outbreak, they've certainly nailed the vaccine rollout, with something like 70% of the population now with COVID antibodies and herd immunity close to being achieved. Another lesson worth learning is British Prime Minister's announcement overnight, Boris Johnson, that there will be an independent commission of inquiry into what's gone wrong, what's gone right in terms of the UK's COVID response.
Our country, like every country, has found itself in the teeth of the gravest pandemic for a century, imposing heartbreaking sorrow on families across the world, with more than 127,000 lives lost in the United Kingdom alone. Amid such tragedy, the state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and as candidly as possible, and to learn every lesson for the future.
Now, Johnson says, and he's absolutely spot on, that the UK has to learn the right lessons from the biggest crisis since World War II, same for us here, and that an independent public inquiry that can cross-examine witnesses under oath and subpoena documents is the best way to do it. He's even promised to testify himself. Now, the mere fact that here we've got a political leader prepared to have himself and his government held to account, well, it just highlights the lack of transparency we've had here in Australia ever since the virus appeared last year. Lack of transparency, Parliament's not sitting, emergency powers ran through, and Mickey Mouse inquiries like we saw in Victoria under Jennifer Coate. Now, with 130,000 COVID victims and an 8% decline in GDP, obviously Britain hasn't suffered way worse than we have. But you think, wouldn't you, that even with only, and I say only in parentheses here, 1,000 deaths in Australia, our $300 billion spend federally alone would justify a full and proper public investigation? You think so? After all, we've just had federal royal commissions into aged care, disability care, banking, bushfires. Malcolm Turnbull even had one into a youth detention centre in the Northern Territory after he watched an ABC program. We're about to have a royal commission, as we should, into veteran suicide, so why not into this pandemic? We know how bad things were in Victoria. Last year, 800 families are bearing the cost of the incompetence of state government and officials. But more than knowing what happened, we deserve to know why it happened and how it happened. Why would anyone in Canberra want to help Daniel Andrews with his cover-up? Here's some other questions that only a Royal Commission, with the powers to compel witnesses and documents nothing like the powers of the Coate inquiry, could perhaps uncover. Why has hotel quarantine worked well in New South Wales, but less well elsewhere? We need to know. Why have contact tracing systems been successful in New South Wales, but less so? Again, we need to know. To what extent did we follow the National Pandemic Plan, last updated and agreed in August 2019, and why was it departed from? To what extent were lockdowns necessary? Or could the vulnerable have been better protected without impacting so much of the wider community? Where's the medical advice that to date has never been publicly released to justify lockdowns? Were state border closures driven by health imperatives or political ones? On the cusp of their elections, and perhaps could less blunt instruments have worked just as well? We need to know. What explains, for instance, the differential policing in Victoria between Black Lives Matter protests in Melbourne, where no arrests were made, and anti-lockdown protests where 400 arrests were made? Or bans on Australia Day last month, 5,000 only at the Shrine in the morning, and those big cyclone fences holding back the veterans. But later that afternoon at the MCG, 75,000 were allowed. No cyclone fences there. We deserve the truth. Were any cost-benefit analyses done of different measures to deal with the pandemic than the ones we went with? Should they be done? Should they be done if lockdowns are now to become the new standard response to any future pandemic? And other things too. I mean, why didn't we look into the domestic manufacture of these new mRNA vaccines last year? Did we put too much emphasis on AstraZeneca? Should we have had mass vaccination centres rolled out back in February from day one? All of this matters now, and it matters for the future, because while we don't know when the next pandemic will come, we know that it will come. That's for certain. After all, we had the Asian flu pandemic in the late 50s, the Hong Kong flu in the late 1960s. You mightn't have noticed it at the time, but there was a pandemic of swine flu in 2009 as well. Now, to date, we're just lucky that for so many, COVID is not much more than a bad cold. But imagine if it was the killer that Ebola is. That alone will tell you why we need an inquiry. We may not be as lucky as we have been this time around. As Boris Johnson said overnight, the inquiry should look at the events of the past year in the cold light of day and identify the key issues that will make a difference for the future. He's dead right. And I hope that our Prime Minister Scott Morrison might make a similar announcement soon. And if a Federal Royal Commission finds that more could have been done to strengthen infection control procedures in nursing homes, and if that's on the federal government's desk, I know it would be uncomfortable. But finding out the truth is a good thing to help it all prevent it all happening again, surely. And if it finds, under the Westminster Doctrine of Ministerial Responsibility, the Victorian government should have been held accountable for hotel quarantine and the fiasco, and ministers should lose their jobs, they should not have hid behind so-called expert advice, wouldn't that improve the quality of our governance and our own trust in the system? If the British government, that has done so much worse than our own, is still prepared to have its actions scrutinised, what is Scott Morrison scared of? What is Daniel Andrews scared of? Anastasia Palaszczuk, Mark McGowan, all of them. And while we're learning from Britain, the UK government has also just announced there'll be legislated protection for free speech on campuses at universities and to stop social media deplatforming speakers. That's yet another thing we should be prepared to look at, and if it works, copy here along with the Royal Commission.